We have about 5 minutes left until we start. So if you're watching this video, you can skip ahead probably about 4 minutes. Good morning, Mr. Rains. Good morning, everybody. If anybody has any questions, we are recording, so it would be a good time to ask them. That way, your classmates can benefit from the questions. I guess since we have 4 minutes left, I'll just do the usual reminders, nothing new at this point. Everybody's probably heard this already. So just the usual stuff. Independent work, you're supposed to write as many papers as you can, whether they be long or short, um, until you hit 100 points, right? So that's worth a full letter grade. So if you haven't started working on that, I highly recommend doing that. I'll remind you that I'm here to help, right? So, for example, if you're doing a pre-lab, it's not like you have to read it and answer the questions on your own. You can meet me online and we can do it one-on-one as if it was an actual lab and it was just me teaching you. So you can do that. Or for the pre-labs before you submit them, you can just meet me online and let me look them over. It could be very quick where I just look it over and say, whoa, whoa, be careful. You won't get any credit because you skipped this part. Or if you want it, I could do it in more detail and actually say, all right, you know, you'll get credit for this, but if you want full credit, you're going to want to fix this and that and the other thing. So please let me help you. Same thing with labs. We do the labs on Wednesday, but if you're like I was as a student, sometimes you don't finish them on Wednesday. So sometimes you go back the day after, or perhaps 2 days after, and you're working on it. And again, if you need me, let me know. We can meet and I can walk you through this and help you. There's a lot of mistakes still. Speaking of which, I guess this is kind of a new announcement slash reminder. Everything else I've said so far is just me repeating myself since it's not 8 yet. But one of the big mistakes I saw in the last lab was the math for the tables. So I think from now on, what I'll do is when we have tables where we all need to collect data, the math won't be on there. You guys should do your own math. Like, for example, well, I won't get into it and waste your time, but yeah, the math was wrong for so many tables. And so if that was you, if you lost a point and you're thinking, well, I didn't do that math, well, you need to do the math instead of trusting your classmates. So, but as always, and here's the old reminder, something I've said before, just because you've turned something in and I've graded it doesn't mean it's done, right? Or it doesn't mean we're done with it. You can always go back and correct your mistakes and get your points back. You can meet me online so I can tell you what to correct, or you can meet me online so I can give you detailed feedback and give you a 5% boost to that grade. What's some other stuff I've said before? It's not quite 8, right? So I don't want to give any new information. Labs, make sure you're on time. I will lock the door after 10 o'clock. Not this week, today, obviously, because we're meeting in online instead of in person. But yeah, you can't be late to labs, so make sure you're on time for labs. What's some other old stuff? Lab exam 1. Many of you still haven't retaken it. You don't have to, but I don't know. There's nothing to lose, right? Just keep retaking it as many times as you want. It's untimed. It's open book. Just retake the exam. And if you get a higher grade, obviously that will boost your overall grade. All right, and that's 8. So then I guess my last regular announcement that I've said 1.5 million times: when we're doing attendance, you have to send the words, right? And you have to send them before 9 a.m. Not just for the points, because this is all extra credit. But if I'm going to consider you present, for the sake of, I have to I have to um, submit my attendance records to the university, right? So just because you were logged in doesn't mean you were present, right? So you have to send those attendance words. I'm sorry to be picky, but I have no other way of knowing if you were paying attention. So yes, send them before 9 a.m. Just in case you're wondering, the reason I do that, the whole before 9 a.m. thing, is because it makes it harder to cheat. Not impossible, but harder. So anyway, any questions before we get started? Okay, well then let's get started. I'm going to pull this up. Oh, I guess I should share my screen first. So we're going to finish up chapter 4 today, and then most likely jump right into chapter 5, which would be perfect because, both of chapter 4 and chapter 5 will be used in this week's lab. So you're going to need to be familiar with them. And additionally, just another reminder before I get started, lab, it works out that we had the snow day today because lab this week, like I said, we're not doing any experiments. We're going to meet, and the whole thing is going to be a pre-lab lecture where I explain the experiments we're going to do next week thoroughly so you know what you're doing before you get there. And I'm going to describe or explain how to write a lab report because you have to write a lab report for this for next week's lab. So no one's asked me yet, and I'm amazed. Usually that's the first question, and I forgot to tell you guys. But your grade for this week is all predicated on you being online for lab, right? So your presence dictates it, right? So if you're on time and you stay the whole time, you get the full 20 points. If you log in 5 minutes late, it'll be adjusted accordingly. So yeah, just that's all you need to do today for lab. Just make sure you're there, make sure you're paying attention. Anyway, if there's no questions, let's get started. This is where we left off. We were talking about anaerobic cellular respiration, mostly as far as the exam is concerned and as far as understanding what you need to understand for the rest of the semester. I've already told you everything you need to know. But again, it's a 100 level course. So I do teach out of the textbook. So we're going to talk about some more of this stuff very briefly, just so when you're reading the textbook, you understand what they're saying. And again, this is the slide that we left off with. So I guess my first word for attendance is a yes or no. Yes or no is going to be one of the words. So what I'm asking you is this stuff that I'm about to tell you, is it important for the exam? Yes or no? So that's your first word for attendance. And one of you, I love it. One of you has been doing extra. Not only you're writing the answers, but you're also writing the questions, and which is great. I love it because it helps jog my memory. But to make life easier for you, you don't have to write the answers too. You can just write or the questions. You can just write the answers. But anyway, there's the slide we left off on. And again, so since we're talking about different types of bacteria and fermentation in bacteria, some of them are called facultatively anaerobic, meaning they can kind of go back and forth. Sometimes they can do aerobic respiration. Sometimes they can do anaerobic respiration. And of course, if it's aerobic, it's not necessarily fermentation. Some of them are obligate, meaning they can only survive that way, right? So they're unable to survive in the presence of oxygen. And again, you don't need to know this for the exam. This is good independent work topics though, right? I'm telling you that some bacteria do this, some bacteria do that. So you could look it up and tell me what kind of bacteria, what are the species? Anyway, any questions about this relatively useless slide? And again, I say relatively because I'm not going to ask any questions about this on the exam. All right. Let's talk about some fermentation characteristics. Again, we're still talking about, well, no, I take that back. Yeah, so all type of fermentations other than lactic acid fermentation, which is one of those that we talked about that you need to know, right? That's the kind that happens in your muscle cells, for example. They all produce gas, whether it be the other type that we talked about, when we talked about the type that produces ethanol, right, alcohol. Remember, it produces carbon dioxide. And then there's a few slides ago that we talked about. Some of them produce methane. But for the exam, you do not need to know this either. So that's a good characteristic. It's interesting to know, but I'm not going to ask you anything about it on the exam. Likewise, let's talk about the important information. Now, this we've already talked about, and I'm kind of repeating myself, but the importance, or another thing you could say is maybe the purpose of fermentation, is to ensure a supply of NAD+ for glycolysis. So to remind you, glycolysis is stripping away these high energy electrons and breaking down glucose to produce ATP, right? That's the purpose of glycolysis. So it strips away the high energy electrons with this NAD plus. Without NAD plus, right, when it's filled with its electrons, and then still technically considered at that point NADH, when it's NADH instead of NAD plus, it can't strip away those high energy electrons. Therefore, glycolysis can't do its thing. Therefore, no ATP is made. Therefore, you have death, right? So that's the importance, the purpose of fermentation. So yeah, I guess this bullet point is kind of important. It's nothing new. I've already said it before, but now here it is again in writing. So yes, you do need to know that for the exam. I'm not necessarily sure there's going to be a question that asks that exact, asks you for that exact information, but it is an important concept. So are there any questions about that slide? All righty, let's move forward. Let's talk about connections to other metabolic pathways. So like I said, a long time ago when we were first starting this chapter, I asked you guys, I said, all right, how many of you have eaten breakfast? Actually, I think most of you didn't raise your hand. But anyway, I said, all right, the last time you ate food, what did you eat? Was it glucose? I asked you, did you eat like straight glucose or did you eat other food? And people, obviously they had eaten other food. But we don't eat straight glucose, right? So far, most of these discussions we've had, when we talked about what we're breaking down in the citric acid cycle, we keep saying glucose, right? High energy electrons come from glucose. We break glucose down and make pyruvate, so on and so forth. And yes, for the exam, that will suffice, right? Focus on glucose for the exam. But now let's go back to reality, right? We don't eat only glucose. So we're going to talk about basically how stuff works when we eat other things. The learning objectives of this section are you should be able to discuss the way in which carbohydrate metabolic pathways, glycolysis, and the citric acid cycle interrelate with protein and lipid metabolic pathways, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, how you just learned about how we break down carbohydrates, specifically glucose? Well, here's how that process works with other stuff that we eat. Anyway, and also by the end, you should be able to explain why metabolic pathways are not considered closed systems. And again, I'll go ahead and tell you now, for the most part, what I'm about to tell you is not very important as far as the exam is concerned, or as far as understanding stuff later in the semester. This is good information for your everyday life, though, right? Because again, you don't eat only like carbohydrates, you also eat protein and lipids. So here we go. So cellular respiration is versatile and burns other kinds of food molecules. Again, right? So I'm just repeating myself here. So the next slide I'm going to show you is going to diagram some of these metabolic routes for carbs, obviously, because we've already talked about carbs, but also fats and proteins, which brings up another independent work topic if you want to look into it. So we've talked about carbs, fats, and proteins, right? We had a whole chapter on biological molecules. One of the things that we talked about that's not on this list is nucleic acids, right? DNA and RNA. So think about it. When you're eating meat or plants, you're eating DNA as well. You're not just eating carbs, fats, and proteins. So for independent work, look that up. What happens to the nucleic acids that we eat? Are they broken down, and do we use those? Remember the monomers, right? Do we use those nucleic acids to build our own DNA and RNA? Do we break those molecules down just like these for the purpose of releasing the energy as well, right? So these are things you can look into. Any questions before I go to the next slide? All right, there's a picture from your old textbook. Put a big question mark next to this. Almost definitely, I'm not going to ask you this stuff on the exam. But if I did, it would be something like this. Like we already know about carbs, right? So we know, because this is what we've been talking about so far. Carbs, as we know from a previous chapter, those break down, even if it's a polysaccharide, those break down into monosaccharides, right? Such as glucose, which is what we've been talking about. And we know, because this is what we've been talking about, that glucose goes into glycolysis, which breaks down into pyruvate, which then breaks down to acetic acid, which is attached to acetyl-CoA, which then goes into the citric acid cycle, so on and so forth, right? So you already know this pathway. This is the one we've been talking about. But let's talk about other stuff, right? What about fats? Remember, as you should know from the previous semester or the previous chapter, when we talk about lipids specifically, right? Lipids are not necessarily polymers, remember, but they are still have different parts. They're broken down into a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, right? So when you eat fats, your body breaks them down into those parts. The glycerol goes into glycolysis. Those fatty acids go into this process where they are converted into acetyl-CoA, and then they go into the citric acid cycle. Proteins, as you should know from the previous chapter, proteins are made up of amino acids. And remember, there's 20 different amino acids, and they all have these different side groups. So they're all very different very different. So depending on which of the 20 amino acids it is, our body can break it down, and maybe it'll go into glycolysis and do the whole process. Or maybe it'll go into this in-between stage between glycolysis and citric acid cycle, where it's converted into acetyl-CoA and then goes into the citric acid cycle. And then maybe, again, depending on which amino acid it is, it might go directly into the citric acid cycle. So if anything, for this exam, I might ask you, if you eat fats, what parts of the cellular respiration, which stages of cellular respiration uses fats? And you need to remember, okay, glycolysis and acetyl-CoA. Or I might ask you, if you eat proteins, which part of which part of cellular respiration do the proteins start, right? And you would need to know all three. If anything, I might just ask you about the fact that amino acids go directly into the citric acid cycle, right? Proteins are the only thing that do this. So it's kind of a superlative, right? So because of that, probably if I were to ask you anything like which between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, which is the only one that can go directly into the citric acid cycle? And the answer is, proteins. So the next word for attendance is, of the 3 different types of food, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, which is the only one that can go directly into the citric acid cycle? That's your next word for attendance. So it's a multiple choice question here, right? Your answer is either going to be carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. Only one of them can go directly into the citric acid cycle. Anyway, before I move forward, I don't know if I said this or not. I think I did, but just as a reminder, this picture is from the old textbook. It's not in your textbook. So if you find it helpful for studying, you're going to need to pull up this PowerPoint from WVSU Online. Are there any questions? All right. You guys are awfully quiet. Oh, that might be it. Is that the last one? That might be the last slide. It is. All right. So let's jump directly into chapter 5. Let's talk about, well, once it loads up, that would be nice. Let's talk about photosynthesis, basically. And I'll remind you, well, I don't know. I guess I'm not reminding you necessarily. So remember everything we just talked about, other than that very last part of the chapter, where it's all about glucose, right? We're talking about, we're breaking down glucose to strip away these high energy electrons, right? High energy electrons come from glucose and go to oxygen, right? So it's all about this glucose is the high energy molecule that we're talking about. So this is kind of finishing the story, right? So now what we're going to talk about is, how do we even get glucose to begin with, right? How do we make this high energy molecule? Likewise, I've said earlier, I think it was in the last chapter and definitely in the first chapter, we said ultimately, and this will definitely be a test question too, ultimately all energy on Earth, with a few exceptions, ultimately came from the sun, right? So this is really closing the gap, because another test question that I've already mentioned before too is, what do our cells directly use for energy? And that's ATP, right? So now this chapter is going to close the gap. How do we get from solar energy to the chemical energy of ATP, right? Well, we're going to talk about how we get from solar energy to glucose in this chapter. So here we go. And hopefully if you were paying attention, you can see how I got this PowerPoint from my online. So if you need to find it, there you go. But yeah, chapter 5, photosynthesis. Another thing I want to mention before we jump into this too is, this is another one of those PowerPoint presentations where I largely liked the way the previous textbook presented the information. So because of that, the PowerPoint is going to be based on that. Therefore, if you follow along closely with what the PowerPoint says versus what the textbook says, you're going to notice some things are a little bit out of order. So you're still learning the same information, just a little bit out of order. You can read about why photosynthesis matters, but I'm not going to take any more time talking about that because at this point, hopefully, it's probably pretty obvious. So here we go. Just like last time when we talked about cellular respiration, we did like an overview, right? And then we got into the specific stages, right? So that's what we're going to do on here too. We're going to talk about some basics that you need to know, like about how plant cells work. Then we're going to literally have an overview of the process, the 2 stages, not the 3 stages this time, the 2 stages. And then once we've done the overview, then we're going to come back in and we're going to talk about these 2 stages in detail. And I'll remind you, like I said last time, when we were talking about respiration, I said a lot of this portion of the exam is going to be me saying, in which stage does this happen? In which stage does that happen? In which stage is this produced? In which stage is this used, right? So that's also going to be largely how this portion of the exam is going to go. So as I'm teaching this, keep that in mind, right? That's the kind of stuff I'm going to be asking you. And speaking of keeping stuff in mind, I'll go ahead and let you know now. The last word for attendance, I'm not giving it to you right now because we've got some time. But at the end, I'm going to say, write 1 question about the material that I've covered. So as I'm giving you this information, you might want to write something down if you find something like, hey, I'm pretty sure I understood that, but I'm not quite sure. Because I will ask you to ask a question. So there we go. So what uses photosynthesis? I'm probably not going to ask you this, but just so you know, the things that use photosynthesis are organisms that we call photoautotrophs. And those include plants, obviously, algae. That's pretty obvious. I think most people are very aware that algae does photosynthesis. Algae happen to be a type of organism called protist, by the way. Anyway, and then there's also certain bacteria that can do this. And again, a great independent work question. Okay, certain bacteria. What kind of bacteria? What kind of bacteria do photosynthesis? Obviously, the basic photosynthesis, the purpose of it is to transform this light energy, which we know living organism can directly use for survival. So we transform this light energy into chemical energy. We can also use it for stuff like food and clothing and wood and energy, but I'm not going to just ask you anything about that on the exam. So are there any questions about this slide? All right. And just as a heads up, I think I mentioned this in the announcement. We have a 2-hour, my children have a 2-hour delay, or had, now they just have no school. Anyway, they're here, and one of them is very loud. So I'm sure you'll hear them in the background, and I apologize. Anyway, so here's a picture from the old textbook, right? Like I said, there's different types of organisms that do photosynthesis, right? So plants, algae, and certain types of bacteria. So there's just a picture of that. So again, let's give you some background information before we can actually jump into how photosynthesis works. The first thing we're going to talk about is chloroplast, which is the site of photosynthesis. Before I even start this, I'll go ahead and tell you this is a test question, and this is very basic, so you should definitely remember this before you start adding details, and someone's going to miss it, and it's going to confuse me and make me feel sad. But there's going to be a test question that says, photosynthesis happens in blank, and respiration happens in blank. Now, we already know from the last chapter that respiration happens in mitochondria, right? And now you know, and I'm about to talk about how photosynthesis happens in chloroplast. So please don't confuse those two. It's very basic. I might actually make that question worth more points since it's so easy. That way it'll help you if you know the basics, but it'll hurt you if you don't even know the basics. Anyway, that being said, let's talk about it. Chloroplast, again, that's the site of photosynthesis. This is where it happens. These are light-absorbing organelles, right? That's the purpose, is to absorb the light and then do things with it. And we'll talk about what they do. And they are found mostly in the interior cells of leaves. And I'm not going to ask you that. But there's a little star next to that to remind me to tell you This isn't always where they're found. They are found in other places, which again, another good independent work topic. So where else are these chloroplasts found? Um, anyway, any questions about this little bullet point before we start talking about the next one? All right, chloroplasts have something in them called chlorophyll. Obviously, as you probably know, chlorophyll is green, and later in this chapter, we'll talk about the physics of why it appears green. Um, and chlorophyll is a pigment, and a pigment is a light-absorbing molecule that plays, in this particular case, this pigment, this chlorophyll, plays a central role in converting solar energy into chemical energy, and we will talk about how that happens. So, as far as test questions are concerned, I could put an X through this because it's not like I'm going to ask any questions about chlorophyll, but you need to understand how chlorophyll works to answer some of the other questions, if that makes any sense. So, as I'm going along teaching how chlorophyll works, keep that stuff in mind. You're going to need to know that. Any questions so far? All right. Some other stuff you need to know. Well, I guess you don't technically need to know about it. This is in the textbook. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask it or not, but leaves also have these things called stomata, right? They're little tiny holes. You can almost think of it as the mouth of a leaf, right? This is where we have gas exchange, right? So this is where we have the carbon dioxide coming in because that's what plants need for photosynthesis, and also water and oxygen going out. So again, I might ask questions about this, but I might not. If I do, it'll only be one question. So this is one of those few things where it's like, hey, just memorize what this word means, and that's it. So any questions about stomata? Okay. Thylakoids. This is another one of those things where I'm not directly going to ask you a question about thylakoids, probably, but I am going to use this word a lot in this chapter. I'm going to use this word in the exam. So to be able to understand what I'm talking about in the exam and in this chapter, for that reason, you need to know what a thylakoid is. And a thylakoid or thylakoids are membranes in the chloroplast where many of these reactions that we're going to talk about for photosynthesis, this is where they happen. They are double membrane. And if you remember, mitochondria was also double membrane. And if you remember, that wasn't a trivial piece of information. The fact that it is double membrane was a reason why it could do what it does. And it's the same thing with this too. And then before I ask if you have any questions, I'm going to do the next slides because I have some visualizations here. This is a picture from the old textbook. So again, if you like this picture for studying, you're going to need to pull up this PowerPoint from my online. But anyway, here's a picture of a leaf. We're kind of zooming in to this like cross section right here, the edge of the leaf, right? And what we have here is like these outside cells that are kind of colored white. And then here's these interior cells, like we said previously, these chloroplasts are usually found on the interior cells of leaves. So there you can see those. You can see the stomata that we talked about that's used for gas exchange and, also water. Anyway, you can see the vein, which we'll never even talk about again, but just so you know, like that's how the water is getting to these cells. And we will hear a lot about water in this chapter. So anyway, so here's all these little cells, and you can see those little cells have green dots. So next we're going to zoom into one of those cells, right? So we're zooming into this particular cell right here, and you can see all these little green dots. This is one cell, right? And you've got all these little green dots inside there. And each one of those little green dots is a chloroplast. So now we're going to zoom into this chloroplast. And this is what it actually looks like here at the bottom. And this is kind of like a diagram that explains it a little bit better. So again, here's these thylakoid. That's a single thylakoid, right? So this whole thing, all of these things are called thylakoid membranes. You can see that they're inside of the chloroplast. Technically, there's some words you don't need to know, like the space inside the thylakoid would be called the thylakoid space. And there's a reminder, like the space inside of a mitochondria was called the matrix, for example. So then the space outside the thylakoids, but yet inside the chloroplast, that's called the stroma. These are all words that I'm not going to ask you about. Stroma I might use, again, when describing something else. But other than that, not very important words. And then technically, when you get a bunch of thylakoid together and you stack them on top of each other, that is called a granum. And again, that's a word I'm not going to use. Let's see here. So the next word for attendance, and I said it a while ago, but if you pay attention with your eyeballs, you can answer this. And it's a multiple choice question again. Which gas leaves the cells out of the stomata? So there's a gas that goes in and there's a gas that comes out. Which one is the one that comes out? Which is the what is the gas that exits the cell via the stomata? So again, I said it in words in the previous slide, and now I'm telling you, if you pay attention and use your eyeballs, you can see the answer to that question, and that will be your next word for attendance. So, are there any questions about this slide before we move forward? All right. So that's the basics of chloroplast. Now I need to learn a little bit of physics. And once we're done talking about some physics, then we'll do the overview of photosynthesis. The first thing you need to know, and I mentioned this when we talked about cellular respiration, everybody learns different, but in my experience, and I've been doing this for a while, the, the best way to learn these processes is to learn the big picture and then start adding details. Like, for example, when we're talking about cellular respiration, I said the biggest thing you need to know is like, hey, what are we trying to produce in photosynthesis or in respiration? ATP, right? And then we started adding the details to that. So here I'm telling you, the biggest thing I think, in my opinion, that you need to know for this, what are we trying to produce in photosynthesis? And the answer is glucose, right? It's all about the glucose because then that glucose goes on to cellular respiration. And then again, that's how we make ATP, right? So glucose. Once you have that memorized, then memorize the equation. So for photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide and water and we use the energy from the light to turn the carbon dioxide and water into glucose, which is what we're after, and also some oxygen, which is a byproduct, right? So memorize that. Then once you have that memorized, then you can start getting into more details. Like, all right, well, which stage is carbon dioxide used and how is it used? Which stage is water used and how is it used? Which stage is glucose produced and how does that happen? And in which stage is oxygen produced and how? Right. So again, that's my recommendation. Everyone learns differently, but that's my recommendation. Are there any questions about this slide before we start digging a little bit deeper into this? All right. So this is a little bit of a throwback as we're going to talk briefly here about what we've already discussed, which was cellular respiration. And to remind you, this whole thing about cellular respiration was basically a story of electrons, right? How we had these high energy electrons that started in glucose and then they were just stripped away as glucose was broken down and all these different processes of cellular respiration. And they were stripped away and they were taken to the electron transport chain. And then they went from protein to protein, giving up that energy, right? And then eventually the oxygen accepted those electrons, which formed water, right? That was the basic story of cellular respiration. And of course, that when I said those electrons are releasing that energy, as you should already know, that released energy was used to make ATP. And also, we had carbon dioxide as a byproduct, right? As we were breaking down that glucose molecule, which is a bunch of carbons stuck together, right? Those, as we were breaking it down, some of those carbons were converted into carbon dioxide. So yeah, that's cellular respiration. So before I even talk about photosynthesis, is one easy way to think about it is this: in many senses, photosynthesis is just the opposite of respiration. So once again, everybody learns differently, but one of my recommendations is to make sure you understand respiration and then start studying photosynthesis, because if you're very good with respiration, then you can just memorize, all right, everything I know about respiration for the photosynthesis. So for example, instead of the electrons like starting at high energy, and slowly start losing their energy until they are accepted by oxygen to form a molecule of water, here it's completely opposite. In photosynthesis, the water is like, hey, here's some regular old electrons. It gives up some electrons, which produces oxygen. And then the process of photosynthesis energizes those electrons until they are used to make a molecule of glucose, right? So it's completely opposite. These electrons are boosted uphill. We're trying to energize them so they can be used in respiration. I want to remind you something again, too, that I said previously when we were talking about respiration. For this exam, you should put these things together. In your mind, when you think of oxygen, you should also think of water. Was that the other one? That might be the only one I was thinking of. It was a water, electron. Yeah, and electrons, right? So that you should almost have like this triangle in your mind where you think oxygen, oxygen, water, and electrons. They're all related because, again, in photosynthesis or respiration, these high energy electrons are accepted by water, which produce, or excuse me, accepted by oxygen, which produces water. In photosynthesis, water puts off these high energy electrons, which then produces a molecule of oxygen. So these three things in your mind should be put together. And also, I'll tell you this, some of these questions will have like, even if you get it wrong, you'll get like partial credit. So even if you mix up, which direction it goes, depending on whether you're talking about photosynthesis or respiration, even if you mix that up, if I remember correctly, you should at least get some partial credit. Anyway, any questions before we move on to the next slide? And again, dig a little bit deeper into this. Okay. Again, this is just a visualization of what we just talked about. This is a picture that you learned in the last chapter, and this is from the old textbook, right? So in respiration, we have these high energy electrons, and it goes through all these processes in which they slowly lose that energy. And when they do, that energy is used to produce ATP. And again, oxygen ultimately accepts those electrons, which forms a molecule of water, right? And in photosynthesis, it's the opposite. Photosynthesis, the water is giving off electrons, low energy electrons, which also happen, and then that process happens to produce a molecule of oxygen. And then those electrons are given energy. They are given energy. They get hot, they get energized and energized and energized until they are incorporated into a molecule of glucose. But also other food too, but we're going to stick with glucose. Here's what you need to know. Photosynthesis occurs in 2 stages. Remember, respiration occurred in 3, photosynthesis occurred in 2. The light reactions and the Calvin cycle. So here's another hint for you, speaking of partial credit. There's going to be a lot of questions, like I've already mentioned, in the photosynthesis section where I say, which stage does this happen? And which stage does that happen? And which stage is this produced? And which stage is that used? And the only 2 correct answers are going to be light reactions or Calvin cycle. If you guess one of those 2 for photosynthesis, you will, even if it's wrong, you will get partial credit. I have people every year who I'll ask a question about photosynthesis and they'll give me an answer that has nothing to do with photosynthesis, right? So some of the options will say something like glycolysis, right? Well, glycolysis is not part of photosynthesis. That's part of respiration, right? So keep that in mind. Write that down if you need to. When you take the exam and you are answering questions about photosynthesis, the different stages of photosynthesis, the only possible correct answers are light reactions and the Calvin cycle. You will get at least partial credit if you are wrong, as long as you guess one of those 2. Any questions about that concept before we start talking about the light reactions and the Calvin cycle? All right. Light reactions. These are of the 2 stages. This is the one that uses chlorophyll, which will definitely be a test question. Which of the 2 stages uses chlorophyll? Light reactions. That should be very easy to remember when you think about it, because like I said earlier, chlorophyll is a pigment, and a pigment is something that's used, right, to absorb light energy. So obviously the light reactions are going to use a pigment because a light reaction is going to be using something that's absorbing light energy, right? So hopefully that should be easy for you to remember. Another thing that happens in the light reactions that you'll need to know for the exam is light reactions using that solar energy produce ATP and NADPH. And I've never given you this word, but hopefully, like I've mentioned earlier in the earlier chapters, if you look at this, hopefully by now you think, yeah, I bet that thing carries electrons, because that looks a lot like NADH and FADH2. And you are correct. This thing just carries electrons. So again, another way to hopefully you can remember this. Light reactions, remember light is energy, right? So you can just think of, actually, let me say something very quickly before I even get back into that. As you're about to learn, Calvin cycle, you can think of it as a sugar factory. It's the thing that's actually making the glucose. And what do factories need? They need energy, right? And they need, well, let's just leave it at that for now. They need energy, right? Factories need energy. If you're going to build stuff, you need energy. So in your brain, again, big picture before you start worrying about the details, the Calvin cycle is actually building what we're after, which is the glucose. It needs energy to do that. And basically the light reactions are basically here to support the Calvin cycle. The light reactions are here to give us that energy that is needed in the Calvin cycle. And again, energy, right? So think light is energy. So if you can remember that light reactions are the things that are giving us the energy, then you could just start thinking of other things that are energetic, like ATP and high energy electrons, in this case carried by NADPH. If you can remember those things, a lot of these test questions should be easy for you, right? Which of the two stages produces ATP? Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons in the form of NADPH? Light reactions, right? It's all about producing this energy. Also, as I mentioned previously, these electrons that we're incorporating into the NADPH that we're energizing, those come from water, right? And again, that process produces oxygen. So a lot of test questions there. And I know I'm going to repeat myself here, but that's okay. Which of the two stages uses chlorophyll? Light reactions. Which of the two stages uses water? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces ATP? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces NADPA? Light reactions. In case I didn't say it, which of the two stages produces oxygen? Light reactions. So any questions about this slide? All right. Next word for attendance. Again, multiple choice. Your answers are either going to be light reactions or Calvin cycle. But which of the two stages produces oxygen? Light reactions or Calvin cycle? That is your next word for attendance. All right. Are there any questions about the light reactions? Again, this is just an overview. We're going to go into more detail about all this. But are there any questions so far about light reactions before we jump into the Calvin cycle? All right. Let's talk about it. The Calvin cycle, basically, like I said earlier, this is the factor, right? This is the thing that's actually making what we're after. It produces the glucose, right? We're all about making the glucose. And I wrote sugar because, glucose is a sugar. And yes, technically, as you're going to learn earlier, it does make different types of sugar. For the sake of simplicity and to help you with the exam, I'm just going to stick with glucose. But yes, the Calvin cycle is the stuff that uses carbon dioxide. Remember, the carbon from the carbon dioxide, it is used to make the sugar. It takes energy to do that. Where do we get our energy from? Well, we get it from the ATP that was produced in the light reactions, right? As we know from respiration, we need some high energy electrons built into the bonds of that sugar, of that glucose, right? Where are those high energy electrons coming from? They are coming from NADPH, which came from the light reactions. So again, test questions here. Which of the two stages produces glucose or sugar, whatever? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses ATP, not produces, but uses ATP? Light reactions. Which of the two stages uses high energy electrons that came from NADPH? Uses. The Calvin cycle uses them. So again, if you can just remember these basic things, that sugar is made up of a bunch of carbons squished together, and it takes energy to do that. And also we want to put some high energy electrons into those molecules. If you can remember that, then you really can answer almost every question about photosynthesis on the exam. Because then it's going to be the Calvin cycle that's making the sugar. And obviously if it's the thing making the sugar, it's going to be the one using the carbon from the carbon dioxide. It's going to be the one using that energy from ATP to squish those molecules together, those atoms together. It's going to be the one that's using the high energy electrons because we want to incorporate that into the glucose. And again, that's just an overview. Are there any questions so far before we move forward? All right, here's a picture of a basic overview. Again, this picture is from the old textbook. I just kept it. You can look at it on the PowerPoint if you want. I like it. It's nice and simple. So again, all this is happening inside the chloroplast, right? We got these thylakoids here. We have this water who's given up some electrons, right? And here in the thylakoid, we're using light energy to excite those electrons. And we're using those excited electrons to produce ATP and NADPH, right? And yes, technically, whenever we're producing ATP, we're obviously getting it from ADP and a phosphate group, right? When we say we're producing ATP, technically what that means is we're squishing that phosphate group back in from the adenosine diphosphate to make it adenosine triphosphate, right? And yes, technically, when we're saying we're producing high energy electrons that's carried by NADPH, yes, technically, that means we're starting with NADP plus. But I'm not going to get that detailed on the exam. In a sense, I just feel like that should just be known, right? When I say we produce ATP, I just hope at this point you just know that it came from ADP and a phosphate group. Anyway, again, it's water that's putting these electrons in here so that we can make ATP and NADPH. But in the process of giving up those electrons, we also produce oxygen. So that's the light reactions in a nutshell. Which of the two stages uses light? Light reactions. Which of the two stages uses water? Which of the two stages produces ATP? Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons and NADPH? And which of the two stages produces oxygen, right? A lot of test questions in this one simple picture. Are there any questions about this one simple picture before we move forward? All right. So then we take the products of the light reactions, and that's then used in the Calvin cycle. So this is, again, everything I'm showing you and saying right now was everything you just saw previously in writing, in words. It's just now visualized. So I'm repeating myself with visualizations here. Calvin cycle, the purpose of it, the whole purpose of photosynthesis in general is to produce this sugar, right? And again, I'm going to call it glucose on the exam, even though there are different types that it produces. So that's what we're ultimately after in photosynthesis, is producing sugar. Sugar is made up of a bunch of carbons, right? A bunch of carbon atoms squished together. Where does that carbon come from? Carbon dioxide. So which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. And a hint, like I said, when we're talking about respiration, any question that involves carbon dioxide with a C, carbon dioxide, you should think of some sort of cycle, whether it be the citric acid cycle producing carbon dioxide in respiration, or whether it be the Calvin cycle using carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. If you can remember those two things, that's going to make your life a lot easier. Anyway, Calvin cycle wants to squish a bunch of carbons together to produce some glucose, right? Well, where is it going to get the energy to do that? It's going to get it from the ATP that was produced in the light reactions. When it builds this sugar, it wants to incorporate some high energy electrons into it. Where is it going to get that? It's going to get that from the NADPH that was produced in the light reactions. So once again, test questions. Which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses, not produces, uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses high energy electrons, or NADPH? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages produces sugar? Calvin cycle. And again, this is still just an overview. And again, this is how I suggest learning it. Hopefully so far, you guys are so far like, this is actually pretty easy. A lot to remember, but not very complicated. Unfortunately, it is about to get a little bit more complicated. Excuse me. So any questions about this slide? All righty. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click this little, you can watch this little video that shows animations of what we've been talking about and what we're about to talk about. So here's a word for you. I keep saying that we want to squish a bunch of these carbon dioxides together to make glucose, and there's a word for that, and it's called carbon fixation. I might or might not ask you this. I don't know. Later in the semester, carbon fixation will be important when we start talking about the environment and how how well, basically, yeah, how the world works, and right, like so far right now we've only talked about cells, right? We've only talked about how cells work, specifically how cellular respiration works, right? How do cells do respiration? Now we're talking about how cells do photosynthesis. Later we're going to talk about how organisms interact with each other and the earth, and at that point carbon fixation will be a little bit more important. Right now this is kind of like I'm just introducing you to the concept. So what is carbon fixation? It reduces carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In this case, I don't mean reduce in the chemical sense. I mean just the usual word use of the word reduce. Like the levels of carbon dioxide go down because of carbon fixation, which in this case, at this point in history, would be a good thing, generally speaking, because less carbon dioxide is good because we have too much at the moment. Obviously, common sense should tell you when you cut down trees, we lose the ability to take as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Conversely, when we plant new trees, we are now taking more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So again, for the exam, this is not very important. But again, later when we start talking about how organisms interact with each other and the environment, at that point, the idea of carbon fixation will be a little bit more important. Any questions about this slide? Okay. So again, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Before we can even really talk about how the light reactions happen, first, we need to have a little discussion about physics. You need to learn about how sunlight works. Then we'll kind of get physics / chemistry and talk about how chloroplast pigments, how the chlorophyll and the other pigments actually work. And then we'll start talking about how the light reaction works. That'll be those last 2 bullet points. So here we go. Sunlight is a type of energy called radiation or electromagnetic radiation. If anything, if I ask you this, and I don't think I will, but if I were to ask you questions about it, I would probably use the term electromagnetic energy as opposed to radiation. So yeah, that's what this is. Just so you know, this type of energy acts as waves and also acts in other ways too, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And the distance between 2 crests is called a wavelength. I'm not going to ask that, but I will be using that term. So it just helps to understand what I mean when I use the term. And this is what I mean, a wavelength, right? So the distance between 2 crests is called a wavelength. And just so you know, this full range of electromagnetic radiation, starting from gamma rays and going to radio waves, that is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And again, I'm not going to test you on that. I probably won't even use that word again, but that's so you know, that's what this is, right? When you see things, when you see light, that's all part of this, all of the same kind of energy, right? So it's the same kind of energy that that you can't see, like UV, for example. What's really powerful and can give you cancer, it can kill germs, right? You can't see it, but it is a type of the same kind of radiation. X-rays, we can't see X-rays, but again, same type of radiation. Gamma rays, when you look out the window, there's radio waves out there. You can turn your radio on and check, but you can't see them, right? So this is just what we can see. Anyway, so far I haven't said anything too important. I'm just building up to it, but just in case, are there any questions about this slide? All right. When light shines on a pigment, certain wavelengths, i.e. colors, are absorbed and disappear from the light that is reflected. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Actually, you know what? I'm going to skip over this 19th century part because that was from the old textbook, and I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But you can read this if you want. I kept it in the textbook. I mean, in the PowerPoint where they talked about this experiment this person did. You know what? I don't want to rush into this, and it's 8:49. So again, your last word for attendance is to think of a question about all the stuff I talked about today, specifically the material, nothing else. And then that'll be your last word for attendance. And that's it. I will be online for office hours, and then I will be online at 10 a.m. for lab. You guys should be there. Remember, don't be late because your grade is based on what time you log in, or not just log in, but yeah, your presence is how you get your full 20 points. And that's it. So you guys have a good Wednesday. I'll see you in about an hour.